I'm Chris Kaiser with MedPage Today InFocus at the European Society of Cardiology meeting in Paris, where researchers are investigating remote interrogation of implantable cardioverter defibrillators. I'm here today with Dr. Gordon Tomaselli, Chief of Cardiology at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore and President of the American Heart Association. Welcome, Dr. Tomaselli.
Thank you.
It's interesting that the two studies today that were presented on remote interrogation of ICDs found that the rate of inappropriate therapy was greatly reduced. There wasn't any cost-benefit data presented, but I want to get your opinion on this move towards remote interrogation in two respects. First of all, is it efficacious for the patient? And second of all, and I don't know if it's more importantly, but definitely important, what will be its impact on the clinics that are getting this daily dose of data rather than data every 3 months?
So, yeah, I think those are good points. The first is that this data is a follow-up on registry data that already exists that's used for remote monitoring of ICDs. And the registry data really has suggested that remotely monitoring patients is safe and probably at least as efficacious, at least in terms of how the device is functioning as seeing the patients in person. Now, these two studies, Evitel and eCost, used remote monitoring systems through basically wireless networks, telephone-like networks, that patients activated, and they activated their devices, and in fact, in the case of Evitel, the frequency with which they transmitted data was actually no different than the frequency with which we would get data in an in-person fashion. So they were transmitting only once every 3 months. The transmitted data could then be used to prompt the physician to have the patient come in and be seen if there was an issue that was identified by the remote transmission. Now, in the United States, we use in our practice remote transmission already for patients to improve compliance with and convenience of having their devices monitored. This is possible because in the States, oftentimes there's more than one doctor involved in the care of these folks. So oftentimes they have a general practitioner, they may have a general cardiologist, and an electrophysiologist such as myself who helps monitor the ICD. So what these two trials did was to try and assess whether or not this was safe to do in a randomized fashion, so that is comparing control, that is standard routine follow-up versus remote follow-up, and trying to assess whether or not it's cost efficient. Interestingly, the cost efficiency data was not available for either one of these trials presented today. Certainly the data are consistent with safety, that is, there weren't any major adverse outcomes either from the device or their own underlying heart disease that were observed in either Evitel or eCost. And it is interesting that there was a reduction in inappropriate therapies. Unfortunately, I didn't get enough information about that particular aspect of the study to evaluate it fully. And I found it hard to kind of reconcile with, at least in the Evitel study, how the protocol ran. I wouldn't have expected that outcome, but in fact they did report that there was a substantial reduction in inappropriate therapies. And inappropriate therapies are the ICD, shocking a patient or pacing a patient for a rhythm that's something other than a potentially lethal lower chamber or ventricular arrhythmia.
And why do you say that you didn't expect that result? Is it because of what you said earlier, that the data really came in every 3 months?
Right, at least in the Evitel data,
Right.
the frequency with which you observe the patient was no more frequent than in the control group, that is seeing the patient every 3 months in person versus having the patient excuse me, transmit their data every 3 months. So I wouldn't have expected a difference in the detection of inappropriate activity of the device or inappropriate therapies for a rhythm that was other than a ventricular arrhythmia.
Now, what about the fact that there was such a large crossover in Evitel of people in the remote monitoring because they had difficulty with the remote technology?
So I think that's another important point to make. If we look at the demographics of people who get defibrillators, they're generally older, and they're generally not as familiar with advanced technology, computers, maybe even PDAs or cell phones. I think most people can learn, but there is an aversion that some people just can't overcome. I would also say that we see patients who, particularly if they don't live far away, just prefer to come in and see us because they may have other questions that don't relate to their device but relate to their general physical health or general cardiological care.
But for the most part, would you agree that this technology, and you even said that you're using it at your institution, would you agree that this technology is beneficial in today's medical world?
Absolutely. I think that it has the potential to really improve convenience for patients in particular. And we see patients that are referred from fairly far away, and for them to have to come back to our arrhythmia center, oftentimes a several-hour drive and occasionally a plane flight, is very inconvenient. So if we can do most of their follow-up remotely, it's much more convenient for them. That doesn't mean we won't ever see them. It means that we'll see them on a less frequent basis.
Now, are you interrogating data on a daily basis from each patient?
No. We're doing things that are similar to these studies in the sense that there is intermittent transmission of data by the patient, routine intermittent transmission of data, but the patient also has the opportunity to actually transmit data if they're having symptoms of any kind. So we can rapidly figure out whether or not that patient needs to be seen for something that might not be quite right. And again, the way the protocols worked in these two studies is similar to what we do. We don't actually get the transmissions directly at the arrhythmia center. Usually they come through the device company. So the device companies have kind of their own proprietary data transmission encryption systems. They receive the data and they will forward the data to us.
And tell me about the staff that is taking care of the incoming data. Do you have nurses, nurse practitioners, technologists, or physicians observing that data firsthand? So
it's all of the above, but the original receivers of the information, we have an incredible staff of device nurses who actually will take the original data, will interrogate it, and oftentimes will organize it in such a way that we get teed up with a specific question about a patient who's transmitted. If there's nothing that's there that's particularly concerning, and they're really quite good at making these diagnoses, then we may not hear about it till their next clinic visit. But if there is something that's of concern, we will hear from our device nurses that there's an issue that needs to be dealt with. So again, we haven't had to, at least yet, increment the number of people on our staff to deal with this. It could be that we will need to, depending upon how much data is transmitted, how frequently it's transmitted. So again, in the analysis of cost, the real cost is going to be an increment in the personnel that's required to handle the load of data should that massive data become large.
Well, is the reason why you haven't really had to add staff, is it because not everybody with an ICD is remotely interrogated, or just that your ICD population is fairly low at this point?
No, I think it's because not everybody is remotely followed. And the other thing is, if you're doing intermittent follow-ups remotely or in person, what generally happens is that it's the number of patients that define the data input, not whether or not the patient's seen face-to-face or remotely. And in fact, it can be much more efficient to see people for routine visits remotely, where they can transmit, their records can be gone over, and you don't actually need to see the patient physically in the clinic and take the time that it takes to actually have the patient evaluated in the clinic. And you just get a transmission from their device. So there certainly could be a cost savings, particularly if routine evaluations are done in the way they're done on a face-to-face basis.
Okay, Dr. Tomaselli, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
I'm Chris Kaiser with MedPage Today, InFocus.